In this video, we're going to go over a bunch of very powerful glyphs from WoW's history that should never make a return to WoW. And starting us off at number 20, we have the Glyph of Endless Wrath. We'll be looking at the second iteration of this glyph, which was in the game from Mist of Pandaria until it was removed at the beginning of the Legion expansion. The Glyph of Endless Wrath made a hunter's pet unkillable, but only while the hunter's Bestial Wrath ability was active. In MoP, the Bestial Wrath ability caused the hunter and pet to grow larger, turn red, and do increased damage. This simple Enrage ability lasted for 10 seconds and had a second component, which was the fact that it also broke the pet free from any loss of control effects. Not only does Bestial Wrath enrage the hunter, but it also enrages the pet. With the Glyph of Endless Wrath, the hunter's pet was immortal during those 10 seconds as it was simply unkillable. The ability already seems pretty overpowered as is. However, based alone on the merits of the glyph itself, it only allows for the hunter's pet, or pets, to be immortal for only 10 seconds, which is how long the buff lasts. 10 seconds of immortality can be quite handy, don't get me wrong, but for sustained fights, the Glyph of Endless Wrath suddenly starts to seem far less appealing. Obviously, this seems like it was made for PvP, but the most important part though is that killing a hunter's pet was already so hard, this glyph didn't really affect anything, since hunter pets were kinda just ignored anyway for the most part. And while this glyph may sound too good to be true at first, Blizz knew it wouldn't cause any real problems, so they went ahead and added it anyway. While a unique and powerful glyph, it wasn't really necessarily all that useful, so the Glyph of Endless Wrath gets put on the stable at the number 20 spot. And at number 19 on this list, we have Glyph of Remove Curse. This glyph affected the mage's ability of the same name, and made it so that when the Remove Curse spell was cast on a target, it also made the target immune to all curses for 4 seconds. This version of the glyph was only in the game for Wrath and Kata, before being changed in Mist of Pandaria. Immunities are always good, but the Glyph of Remove Curse only granted immunities to curses, not poisons, diseases, or other types of nasty debuffs. Additionally, 4 seconds really isn't that long, probably not long enough to negate more than 1 or 2 casts of most curse abilities. This made the glyph more of a novelty really, and only very useful in pretty niche situations, such as Warlock spamming curses onto targets in PvP. Even though the Glyph of Remove Curse was a nice offensive ability, it really only had a few niche uses. And at number 19, we have a tie between two very simple glyphs, which are the Glyph of Dragon's Breath and the Glyph of Maim. Both of these abilities increase the damage done by the ability modified by 100%. A 100% increase in damage is the greatest straight up percentage number increase out of all the glyphs for DPS. First, let's look at the Glyph of Dragon's Breath. There are 2 iterations of the Glyph of Dragon's Breath, a Cataclysm version and the WoD version. We'll be taking a look at the WoD version, which only stuck around for 1 expansion. The main reason why this glyph was added was because in Worlds of Draenor, the Dragon's Breath ability, when chosen, replaced the Cone of Cold ability, which did DPS and snared players. Dragon Breath used to also snare players, but that had long been removed by the time WoD rolled around. To make Dragon's Breath more a viable option, Blizzard buffed the DPS on Dragon's Breath so it could compete with Cone of Cold. As it turns out, this was not enough to make Dragon's Breath a popular talent in WoD, so Blizz again buffed the ability by 150% in a late hotfix towards the end of Worlds of Draenor. This meant that with the Glyph of Dragon's Breath and after the baseline buff, the Dragon's Breath ability was doing 250% more damage than it was at the beginning of the expansion. Keep in mind, this is also ignoring stat and gear inflation as the expansion progressed as well. The other glyph in the number 18 spot is Glyph of Maim, which affected the druid's ability, Maim. Similar to the Glyph of Dragon's Breath, this 100% increase to DPS ability was only around for the WoD expansion. The Maim ability is a finishing move which requires a cat form to complete and is also a stun, which means feral druids are particularly fond of using it when coming out of stealth to surprise and then instantly stun their prey in PvP. There's not much more to say about this glyph other than the Maim ability was only available to feral druids in WoD, so this glyph just may have been part of trying to make the feral spec more attractive to druid players overall. While it should be plain to see that a straight up increase of 100% to a DPS ability is pretty overpowered, these 2 glyphs are only the number 18 spot on this list because these glyphs were more of a band-aid fix than anything else. These glyphs were only implemented in the first place because of how low the damage on these abilities were in the first place. While scaling was a somewhat novel concept in WoD, the fact that Dragon's Breath ability got another 150 bonus damage buff just goes to show you they weren't the best abilities in the game, and that even such a massive buff were only bringing them up in line to most of the other abilities in the game that were doing at the time. Granted, while abilities and percentages are always tweaked around for certain spells and abilities in every patch and hotfix, an ability that just gives a straight up 100% increase is a rare thing indeed. And goes to show that while these glyphs may seem very impressive at first, once examined, they are far less cool and potent than maybe you first thought. Since the Glyph of Dragon's Breath and the Glyph of Maim are 100% DPS increases, but they only increase the damage of CC abilities whose main goal isn't to damage anyway, which is why they're lower on this list. And at number 17, we have a fun glyph called Glyph of Soul Swap. We'll be looking at the second iteration of this glyph, which was so powerful it was only in the game for 1 expansion, which was Worlds of Draenor. For those of you unfamiliar with how the Warlock Soul Swap ability works, It essentially allows a Warlock to copy-paste dots onto an enemy target. It accomplished this by taking a snapshot of the damage over time debuffs on one enemy and moving them over to another. The Glyph of Soul Swap extended the duration of how long the Warlocks could hold the dots, all the way up to 30 seconds. This allowed the Warlock to hold onto the dots from fight to fight more easily, since normally casting all of your dots on one target could take 4 global cooldowns. So being able to apply all of them to one target with one GCD instead was amazing in PvP for target swaps, or to take down an ad quickly in a boss fight. However, what made the glyph holding the dots for so long so valuable was the fact that you could use it to simply reapply dots to existing targets, and just to save your 4 global cooldowns. So you'd cast your dots, take a snapshot with Soul Swap, and then reapply them all with one button instead of 4 30 seconds later. And at number 16, we have a very cool glyph that greatly enhances damage. The first of these is the Glyph of No Escape, which is a glyph that affects the Hunter ability Freezing Trap. The Freezing Trap ability is exactly what it sounds like. The Hunter throws a trap which will then freeze an enemy that comes into contact with it. While damage will break the freeze effect, the Glyph of No Escape provides a nasty surprise in that it increases the range crit chance of the enemy trapped inside by 100%. The only downside to this glyph, aside from the RNG crit values, is the fact that the Hunter literally only gets one shot before the damage breaks the trap. The Glyph of No Escape turned a CC ability into a possible burst window. However, Hunters were not very well known for having large hits to take advantage of that one guaranteed crit. So, like a lot of the other glyphs on this list, it looks a lot better to non-Hunters and it really worked out in practice. Up next, number 15, we have Glyph of Nature's Grasp. This glyph was only available during the MoP expansion and affected the Druid ability, Nature's Grasp. This ability works somewhat similar to the Thorns ability, in that an enemy who attacks a Druid is afflicted with a debuff. In the case of Nature's Grasp, hitting the Druid would root the target for 45 seconds. The glyph was very simple in that it reduced the cooldown of the ability by 45 seconds. This may not seem like much, but the cooldown on the spell was only 1 minute, which means it decreased the cooldown by an insane 75%. Realizing this ability would be too OP, Blizzard put several nerfs on it in MoP, like making it so the root could only proc on one target and not have multiple charges. The 75% reduced cooldown for this ability was the strongest cooldown reduction from a glyph, aside from some ones that could just instantly reset the abilities. It could theoretically be used against enemy players every 7 seconds after one root ended, since the root lasted for 8 seconds and the cooldown was 15 seconds with the glyph. If it wasn't for diminishing returns anyway. Even with the diminishing returns in PvP and all of the massive nerfs Blizzard placed on the Glyph of Nature's Grasp in MoP, the devs went ahead and decided to remove it with the launch of WoD, probably deciding it was too OP. The next iteration of the glyph affecting the Entangling roots appeared in WoD, and that is the glyph which we'll now turn our attention to. If you thought you could escape the grasp of Entangling roots, think again. The glyph at number 14 is the Glyph of Entangling Energy. This glyph allowed the Boomy, which had just killed an enemy that yielded experience or honor, to have their next Starfire or Wrath also apply Entangling roots to the target. This was a glyph that combined 2 abilities into one, and while there were many combo glyphs, the Glyph of Entangling Energy was particularly potent because it combined a root and a damage ability. This effectively gave the Boomy an extra root without having to cast the ability, and it was also widely used as a leveling glyph, since you could just open up on a mob and then have them stay put for a while you apply dots. We've put the Glyph of Entangling Energy slightly above the Glyph of Nature's Grasp for one main reason, and that is the fact that with the Glyph of Entangling Energy, you just save a global cooldown. The biggest obvious downside, of course, was the proc requirement of a kill, so it was nowhere near as on-demand as the Glyph of Nature's Grasp. Up next, number 13, we have Glyph of Freezing Trap, which modified the Hunter's ability, Freezing Trap. Although this glyph was added in Wrath, we'll be looking at the more potent version from Cataclysm until Legion. For 6 years, this glyph allowed the Hunter's Freezing Trap to slow its victim's movement speed by 70% for 4 seconds after the trap had broken. While damage does cancel the trap's freeze, it would immediately apply the slow debuff, meaning Hunters essentially had a combo Incapacitate and Slow ability. While this seems like a very good glyph, it is actually a bit less overpowered than it sounds. You see, the main use of Freezing Trap in PvP was to CC healers for the full duration so you could burst down a priority kill target, or to stop an enemy spellcaster from free casting and CCing your own healers. So a slow applied after the CC broke didn't really matter in these cases. And to add on to that, the melee fighters in PvP are usually full of dots and being pelted with damage, so they'd break the Freezing Trap immediately anyway if you bothered to use it on them. In which case the glyph would finally have some use. What further made Freezing Trap weaker is that Hunters already had other slows in Concussive Shot, Snake Trap, and even Wing Clip in some expansions. So this extra slow from the Glyph of Freezing Trap wasn't really needed, but it still might be handy in niche situations. Now, while a 70% slow isn't unheard of in the history of the game, such as the old Rogue's Crippling Poison, it is much more rare in later versions of the game. In Dragonflight, there is only one 70% slow in the modern game, and that's Flying Serpent Kick ability the monks have. One final note before we move on is that the Glyph of Freezing Trap is mutually exclusive with Glyph of No Escape, which was the glyph we covered in the number 16 spot. Now we move on to the number 12 spot with a glyph that would make Illidan proud. The glyph is called the Glyph of Preparation, but unfortunately it modifies a rogue ability and not a demon hunter ability. The rogue's preparation ability itself resets the cooldown of many rogue abilities. The glyph expanded this cooldown to instantly reset the rogue's kick, dismantle, and smoke bomb abilities. This glyph was so overpowered that Blizzard removed the glyph when Mop rolled around, and during Cataclysm, the devs also removed the Evasion and Blade Fury abilities from the list of abilities that Preparation could reset. While the Preparation ability itself was pretty overpowered and was removed in Legion, the main focus of the glyph for us is the fact that it could instantly reset the smoke bomb. Smoke bomb basically made it so no one could target the people inside of the smoke bomb, and being able to double up on it, and being able to try it again on a kill target PvP in case they somehow managed to escape the first one was just very good. Next up at 11th place, we have Glyph of Fortuitous Spheres. This glyph was added to monks in patch 5.4 and served a unique purpose. Instead of augmenting an additional ability, it granted a unique healing buff. If the monk fell below 25% health, a healing sphere would automatically appear near them at no cost. Aside from the obvious healing effect, this safeguard healing on a low health was completely automatic. It meant all the monk had to do was absorb the green ball for health. The Glyph of Fortuitous Spheres lasted throughout WoD before it was removed in Legion, and while it was a very nice quality of life ability, it was so overpowered that Blizzard had to add a nerf to it. In this case, they made it so the glyph could only proc once every 30 seconds. The glyph was nice only because the monk didn't have to cast any healing spells on themselves the first time their HP dipped considerably. This saved some cast time for other abilities and allowed for a second chance, so to speak. While healing spheres are still in the game, they are no longer automatic and are instead tied to other abilities. And at number 10, we have another healing glyph, this time in the form of the Glyph of Drain Life. This is a simple but effective glyph that modifies the Warlock's ability Drain Life by increasing its healing by 100%. Although added in MoP, it wasn't until Worlds of Draenor when the glyph became truly overpowered with its 100% increased healing power, since at MoP it only increased healing by 30%. Drain Life is one of the few ways that Warlocks can restore their HP. The main other famous ability is the Healthstone, but those have a cooldown in a limited amount. The Glyph of Drain Life only lasted for one expansion, as it was removed when Legion launched. Hopefully this video isn't draining life out of you, as it's the number 10 on our list and makes it the halfway point in our countdown. Now we turn our attention from healing glyphs to silences and interrupts. At the number 9 spot, we have Glyph of Gag Order. This major glyph was for warriors and allowed their pummel and heroic throw abilities to silence the target for 3 seconds. The glyph was added in MoP and pretty soon it was deemed too overpowered. And within a few months of MoP launching, it was made so the glyph no longer worked on players. Additionally, the effect could only occur once every 15 seconds because even that was too strong versus NPCs. Still, having an offensive range interrupt was a huge deal for warriors, and it changed a lot of gameplay for them in MoP and Worlds of Draenor. Warriors didn't have to be melee ranged to interrupt enemy spellcasters anymore, and so they could interrupt a slow or stun that was being cast and then charge to their target. The Glyph of Shield Slam also deserves a brief mention here because it acted very similar as an offensive action for warriors and allowed them to dispel beneficial magical effect with their Shield Slam ability. However, Gag Order remains one of the most gameplay altering glyphs on this list, and had it not been changed so early, it would have been much higher on this list. And at number 8, we have a tie between two healer glyphs that are very similar. First up is the Glyph of Enchanted Bark. This glyph modifies the druid ability Barkskin, which when activated reduces the damage taken for a short period of time. The Glyph of Barkskin added a second component to this ability, and for 5 seconds after activating Barkskin, the druid was immune to silence and interrupt effects. This glyph only lasted for one expansion, which was Warlords of Draenor. Additionally, this glyph was only available to restoration druids, meaning tanks and DPS players couldn't use it. In fact, at the beginning of WoD, Feral Druids lost the Barkskin ability entirely, making this glyph completely useless for them. An immunity to silence and interrupts should be obvious as to why they're good, since such a defensive ability would simply be too strong for most druid specs, especially in PvP situations. The other glyph in the number 8 spot is the Glyph of Zen Focus. This Mistweaver Monk glyph offers the same 5-second immunity to silences and interrupts as the Glyph of Enchanted Bark, but in this case it's when the monk uses their Thunder Focus T ability. The Thunder Focus T ability improves several healing abilities when used, ranging from reducing cooldowns to increasing healing to no mana cost. The Glyph of Enchanted Bark and Glyph of Zen Focus were essentially added so healers didn't have to get interrupted as much in PvP. In most PvP situations, taking out the healer is usually the most efficient way of slaughtering enemy players. These two glyphs make the healer's job a little less tedious, since every healer dreads interrupts and silences. Both the Glyph of Enchanted Bark and Glyph of Zen Focus also had some uses in dungeons and raids, but most of their value came in PvP combat. Overall, the Glyph of Zen Focus is probably a little bit more overpowered since its cooldown is only 30 seconds, compared to Barkskin's ability having a somewhat longer cooldown of 45 seconds. And at number 7, we have another healer glyph with more immunities. This time we have the Glyph of Inner Focus affecting the Holy Priest ability Inner Focus, making them immune to silence, interrupt, and dispel effects for 5 seconds. For those of you unfamiliar with the Inner Focus ability, it reduces the mana cost of the priest spell by 100%, and increases the critical effect chance of the next spell by 25%. As you can probably guess, a healer able to cast any spell with no resource cost, and being able to do so without being stopped is pretty good. The glyph was added to the game at the beginning of MoP, and was removed from the game shortly after in patch 5.2. However, only the glyph itself was removed. Since the glyph had become so popular and widespread, Blizzard simply incorporated the 5-second immunities into the baseline version of the spell, starting with patch 5.2. The Inner Focus ability was removed from the game entirely in WoD, before making a brief reappearance as an honor talent in Legion. However, in Legion, this spell no longer affected most spells, no longer reduced mana costs, and no longer provided immunities to dispels, making it a much weaker version than the ability the Holy Priest had in MoP. Finally, the Inner Focus ability was completely removed from the game in BFA, and the talent system revamp in Dragonflight didn't even see this ability return, meaning that the Inner Focus ability and the Glyph of Inner Focus are now out of focus for good. This glyph and its subsequent transfer to an ability only lasted for 3 seasons, making it the shortest glyph on this list so far, which goes to show you how overpowered it was. Additionally, since it grants 3 immunities instead of 2 from the previous entry, the Glyph of Inner Focus is a little bit higher on this list. At number 6, we have the Glyph of Reflective Shield. The Reflective Shield ability was another priest ability that has been a talent in the game since vanilla. The Reflective Shield ability causes damage absorbed by the priest's power word shield to be reflected back to the attacker. With the talent revamp in MoP, the Reflective Shield ability was removed from the game, and in its place came the Glyph of Reflective Shield. This glyph provided the same effect as the ability had, only to a much stronger degree. The original Reflective Shield ability had 2 ranks, with the first rank causing 20% of the damage absorbed to be reflected back to the attacker, and the second rank caused 45% of the damage to be reflected. The glyph version, when it was first added to MoP, kept the same level of damage at 45%. However, when patch 5.4 rolled around, this amount was doubled to an insane 70%. While it's still a shield and would break with enough damage, having 70% of the damage reflected back to you is not a good thing. Additionally, the power word shield lasted for 15 seconds, as long as it didn't break, meaning this reflection of damage also lasted for 15 seconds. The power word shield ability was more noticeably overpowered and nuanced in PvP situations, where it could be used in a variety of ways. A few notable examples of this included the fact that the shield made players immune to pushback and daze effects, and could also absorb damage for a rogue and druid as they went into stealth in order not to break it. The Glyph of Power Word Shield only remained in the game for 1 patch and was removed at the beginning of WoD, and its effects were incorporated into the baseline ability. However, this ability proved to be so overpowered that in WoD, the reflection component of Power Word Shield received not 1, but 2 major nerfs focused on PvP. The first nerf was that the reflective part of the spell could no longer work on other players, and only applied to the priests themselves when they cast the ability on themselves. This was implemented less than 2 months into WoD, and would be another 14 months before another hotfix came to the ability, this time cutting the reflective damage done in half down to 35%. Another minor nerf to the ability in WoD also reduces absorption amount by 20%. Even in the BFA expansion, the absorb component of the spell was heavily nerfed, showing that it was still overpowered. Now, as OP as this glyph is in its original form and may have sound, there were several drawbacks, which is why it's only at number 7 spot on this list. First, while the Power Word Shield ability in MoP did have a pretty quick cooldown of only 6 seconds, only costs around a third of the priest's mana and lasts over 15 seconds, a mechanic had been in the game in vanilla to make the ability a little less overpowered. That was the debuff called Weakened Soul, which prevented a player from receiving another Power Word Shield on them for the same priest for 15 seconds after the previous one ended. This debuff is not unique to this ability, as a similar ability for paladins called Forbearance exists, which occurs when a paladin uses the ability Lay on Hands to instantly return a player to full health, or a number of other abilities. Given how powerful this ability is, it grants a debuff called Forbearance on the player it was used on, and this debuff lasts for 30 seconds. With Dragonflight Talent Revamp, the ability was renamed to Crystalline Reflection, and the damage reflects is only 12%, which is nearly 83% lower than the glyph originally reflected. With its original name gone and only a fraction of its power remaining in the game in a different iteration, the Glyph of Reflective Shield will probably never return to the game again. And at number 5, we have Glyph of Victory Roll. This glyph is probably a pun on the warrior ability Victory Rush, since it recharges an ability when you kill an enemy. In this case, the glyph affects the monk ability Roll, and allows the monk to gain 1 charge of Roll or Chi Torpedo whenever they kill a target that grants experience or honor. So why is this glyph at number 5 on our list? Well, it's quite simple really. As long as enemies are low level and the monk can plow through them, the monk essentially has a non-stop roll ability. The near constant speed buff in old content may sound familiar to some players, and I'm referring to the Bear Tartar food from Legion, which gave you a speed boost when you killed an enemy. The big difference between these two is that the Bear Tartar worked on any kill, and the Victory Roll glyph states targets that grant experience, which means the Glyph of Victory Roll would not work in legacy content like the Bear Tartar did. When you think about these two items, they are actually quite similar, and the Glyph of Victory Roll may very well have inspired the Bear Tartar food from Legion. The Glyph of Victory Roll could still be useful in the current day content, and was especially useful in PvP. For example, imagine a monk grabbing a flag in a battleground and then killing a player, and then suddenly they have an extra roll to get their flag to the base quicker. Up next at number 4, we have a 5-way tie. All 5 of these glyphs reduce the cost of abilities they modify by 100%, meaning the abilities no longer cost any resource to use. These glyphs span across 4 classes and will start in alphabetical order with the Death Knight glyph. The Glyph of Hungering Cold was added in Wrath, but became most potent in Kata when it reduced the runic cost of Hungering Cold ability down to 0. The Glyph of Hungering Cold was removed when mob launched, and because it was so popular and overpowered, part of its effects were added to the baseline DK abilities. The next glyph is the Glyph of Savagery, which could only be used by Feral Druids and mob. This glyph made the Savage Roar ability cost 0 combo points, and since Savage Roar ability was a temporary DPS increase of 30%, the glyph was quite powerful. Savage Roar's only downside was that it had a 12-second cooldown in Mist of Pandaria. The Glyph of Savagery was removed with the launch of Warlords of Draenor expansion. The last 2 glyphs both affected warrior abilities. The Glyph of Furious Sundering and Glyph of Hamstring were both added in MoP and removed in Warlords of Draenor. While the Glyph of Furious Sundering is exactly like the previous 3 glyphs listed in this entry in that it reduces the cost completely of the ability, the Glyph of Hamstring is a little bit different. The glyph only worked with the warrior ability Hamstring ability once, and it made their next Hamstring ability free. The Hamstring ability makes the enemy move slower, so having an extra proc of Hamstring certainly did help in a lot of cases, especially in PvP when other players were trying to escape from the warrior in melee range. It should be obvious why having abilities that cost no resource is good, and the fact that almost all of these glyphs only lasted for 1 expansion highlights this fact. While resource management was already somewhat relaxed in WoD compared to earlier versions of the game, the ability to have a free spell was nevertheless useful, and these 5 glyphs represent the highest amount of resource reduction out of all the glyphs in the history of the game. And at number 3, we have the Glyph of Ice Block, which modifies the mage's ability, Ice Block. When it was first added in Wrath, the glyph reset the cooldown of Frost Nova every time the Ice Block ability was used. The Ice Block ability makes the mage immune to all damage for a short period of time, and the Frost Nova ability freezes enemies in their place for a short bit. While this glyph itself was pretty handy, it received an upgrade in the Mist of Pandaria expansion. In both MoP and WoD, the Glyph of Ice Block made it so that when the Ice Block immunity terminated, it triggered an instant free Frost Nova and made the mage immune to all spells for 3 seconds. With this version of the Glyph of Ice Block, the Ice Block abilities served not 1, but 2 immunities. The first is immunity to all damage while the mage is encased in the ice, and the second is extremely useful because 3 seconds after the Ice Block ends, the mage is free to cast spells without being interrupted. This essentially granted the mage the ability to use whatever quick spell they wanted to cast without having to be worried about being interrupted. On top of all that, the Frost Nova component of the glyph allowed for 100% reduced cast time at instant speed and 0 mana of the Frost Nova ability itself. This allowed for mages to pop Ice Block as soon as it stopped, and they would instantly shed a Frost Nova and can blink away from their enemies. The reason this glyph was powerful because it not only just combined 2 abilities, but combined 2 very useful abilities and then added the extra bonuses on top of it. The only downside to the Glyph of Ice Block was that it was mutually exclusive with the Glyph of Regenerative Ice, which healed the mage for 4% of their total health every second they were trapped in their Ice Block. The Glyph of Ice Block was removed from the game in Legion. Components of this glyph still exist in the game, but the entirety of its effect can never be completely re-added to the game, as it would just make mages very hard to kill, if not impossible. Mages are already hard to kill in the Ice Block, but imagine finally getting a mage to low health, they pop Ice Block, and then as soon as Ice Block ends, they come out blazing with a flurry of spells and blink away, killing you instantly and laughing at you. While this glyph seemed to originate from a defensive point, if a mage really needed Frost Nova and it was on cooldown, they could pop Ice Block, wait a couple seconds, and then have another free Frost Nova cast all by itself. And at number 2, we have Glyph of the Leer of the Ox. This glyph was only available in MoP and WoD, and it affected the Black Ox statue ability that monks have. The Leer of the Ox ability is an interesting ability, and it's only one of a handful of taunt abilities to have been removed from the game. The only way to learn the Leer of the Ox ability was from this glyph, and only a handful of abilities were learned from glyphs, once again making Leer of the Ox something of an outsider. This ability was a mass AoE slow that affected all targets which were taunted by the monk's Black Ox statue. Specifically, this slow rate is a 50% reduction in movement speed. While a 50% slow isn't as much as a 70% slow, when we covered in the Glyph of Freezing Trap segment in number 13, the Leer of the Ox is far more overpowered for 3 reasons. First, it could affect all enemies within 40 yards of the Black Ox statue, meaning there was effectively no number limit to it. Second, this debuff lasted for 6 seconds. Finally, the AoE taunt provided for an enormous amount of mobs to be slowed pulled to a single location, which was perfect for AoE abilities to tear them down. This ability was also widely used to farm mats in AoE fashion in the open world. Typically, players would find a location where there was a fast respawn of mobs and make all the gold from selling mats and BOEs. The Leer of the Ox ability was removed when Legion launched, and it's easy to see why. With the introduction of the Mythic Plus system in Legion, the Leer of the Ox ability would have made pulling massive trash mobs and AoEing them down a piece of cake. The one ability could have completely negated a huge new point of the gameplay for the expansion, and Blizz simply couldn't let that happen, so they removed the ability from the game. The Leer of the Ox ability is so overpowered because it combines a mass taunt with a mass AoE, something which has never returned to the game. The only thing that came close to this ability was the Shaman Stoneclaw Totem, but that was removed in Mist of Pandaria. The Stoneclaw Totem AoE taunted mobs and had a 50% chance to stun for 3 seconds. However, its radius was 5 times smaller than that of Leer of the Ox. And finally, at number 1, we have Glyph of Demon Hunting, which taught the ability Dark Apotheosis. This ability was only available to Demonology Warlocks and was only available during the Mist of Pandaria expansion. The Dark Apotheosis ability was essentially a Demon Hunter role-playing ability, along with a similar ability called Metamorphosis. Dark Apotheosis is a big ability that affects a lot of different spells and stats and can be somewhat thought of as a different form that druids might be able to take, but for warlocks. This Dark Apotheosis has a ton of components and will try to break them all down. Even Blizzard had a hard time balancing this ability, and its complexity was probably a contributing factor in Blizzard just letting it go. First, let's cover the basic stat boost this ability gives. While in the Dark Apotheosis form/stance, physical damage against them is reduced by 10%, and magic damage against them is reduced by 15%, and also increase your threat generation by 500%. On top of this, you can add another Warlock talent like Nether Plating, which increase your armor by 250% while in demon form and reduce stuns and snares by 35%. While in Dark Apotheosis, several abilities were changed into different ones that had increased effectiveness. Among these, Hellfire became Immolation Aura, Shadowbolt became Demonic Slash, and Fear became Sleep. The Soul Shatter ability in Dark Apotheosis taunted targets rather than decreasing their threat. Additionally, the Twilight Ward ability now absorbed all schools of magic damage as opposed to just holy or shadow damage. So not only did Dark Apotheosis have the most changes to abilities out of all the glyphs in the history of WoW, it also completely altered gameplay like no other glyph in the history of WoW had. Dark Apotheosis could essentially turn a Warlock into an off-tank, which is pretty impressive when you stop to think about it. Although Dark Apotheosis was removed at the beginning of WoD for just being too hard to balance, it's not until Legion that the real reason Dark Apotheosis could never return to the game becomes clear. Legion introduced the Demon Hunter class, which has heavily inspired the Warlock abilities of both Dark Apotheosis and Metamorphosis. A ton of these abilities were copy-pasted and slightly changed or tweaked to fit the Demon Hunter class as opposed to the Warlocks. The Metamorphosis ability for Demon Hunters even kept the same name it had when Warlocks had it, as did the Immolation Aura ability. Likewise, the Demonic Strike ability becomes Chaos Strike, and Demonic Leap ability for Warlocks was incorporated directly into Metamorphosis ability for Demon Hunters. Because elements of the Dark Apotheosis ability were removed from one class and then incorporated into a new class, the old Warlock abilities can never return, as it would make two different classes feel too similar. Not only was Dark Apotheosis a super unique ability, but it saw some later reincarnations in the Demon Hunter class, meaning it for sure can never return to the game, which is why the Glyph of Demon Hunting lands the #1 spot on this list. Alright, and that's it for this very long video. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video and for giving me the privilege of your time. This video is the third in a series, and we'll have a couple of other videos on minor glyphs and prime glyphs throughout all of WoW's history if you want to check those out, which will have a link in the description. There are thousands of glyphs in the game, but if we missed any ones you feel that should have been mentioned here, drop a comment below and maybe we'll make a part 2 of this video.